The fact that they did not cover this, it is journalistic malpractice, to say the absolute least. Look, you had Joe Biden in the early stages of the primary say that China is not a strategic threat to this country, and we all kind of raised our eyebrows that he said that. Well, now we know why, because there was 10 for the big guy, because there was Joe Biden getting involved in the China funds coming into his family. And the fact that you had a dereliction of duty in the press to not even cover this, not even ask a question, to jump on this, call it Russia disinformation. That is what they called it. While meanwhile, they made money, they made big bucks off of using Russia disinformation to go after this president. It is simply remarkable. It should enrage every American. It should certainly enrage the 14% who said they would not have voted for Joe Biden had they known this in advance.
Back in October, Hunter Biden's former business associate, Tony Bobulinski, claimed the Biden family shrugged off concerns that Joe Biden's alleged ties to Hunter's business dealings could put a future presidential campaign at risk. Watch this.
And I remember looking at Jim Biden and saying, how are you guys getting away with this? Like, aren't you concerned? And he looked at me and he laughed a little bit and said, plausible deniability.
Wow. Remember that? But the media largely ignored those claims back then until now. And here with more, New York Post columnist Miranda Devine. Hey, Miranda.
Hi, Ainsley. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. When you look at what the media's coverage of that, I mean, he's talking about details of Joe Biden knowing about his son's business dealings and Joe Biden's influence and involvement in this. And the media barely covered it. Look at that. MSNBC, a little more than a minute. CNN, 0. ABC, 0. NBC, 1:30 about. And CBS, 0 minutes. Fox covered it. But this was extremely important, especially before an election.
Well, exactly. The New York Post story broke on October 14, which is more than 2 weeks before the election. It should have been covered. And instead, it was actively suppressed. It was ignored. We heard Project Veritas had these CNN morning news conference meetings that were leaked. And in there, they said, look, we're not going to cover this. They were proud of it because they said there's nothing new in the New York Post's information. Well, there was a lot of new stuff in what we published from Hunter Biden's laptop, and that included, for the very first time, evidence that the then Vice President Joe Biden knew about what was going on with his family's influence peddling schemes around the world and was actively involved. Now, we published an email to that effect, and later on, Tony Bobulinski backed that up with further evidence of his own. All of that was a story, and yet you acting as Russian agents. It was all a ruse to get their man over the line in the election, to get Joe Biden across the line with zero scrutiny into what really is a fishy story. And now, of course, they're reporting it because they think that they've won.
You know, it's frustrating for conservatives because they saw what happened with Hillary Clinton with the dossier. They went after President Trump for 4 years. They did every negative story on President Trump. Barely any positive stories on him if you look at the stats. They did all these praised pieces on Biden. Biden stays in his basement, doesn't come out, doesn't go, he doesn't answer questions. President Trump answers every question, and then they criticize everything that he says. And then when voters go to the polls, 74 million of them to vote, they're worried that their votes didn't count or that something fishy happened. The president says it was rigged. Gallup poll, 89% of Republicans say there's serious doubts about this election process. Quinnipiac poll, 77% of Republicans believe there was widespread voter fraud. What's your message to conservatives who just feel betrayed? They feel like they're forgotten?
Well, it's not just conservatives. I've seen polls showing that 30% of Democrats and almost half the country thinks that there was something untoward about the election. And look, it's a serious problem, and the reason for it is because the Democrats decided under the cover of COVID that they would change the rules at the last minute. That has just added with all this mail-in ballots, which are so susceptible to fraud, industrial strength mail-in balloting. It's just added to this terrible sense that something didn't go right with the election. And I don't know how you fix that, because people have a feeling already before Inauguration Day that if Joe Biden is in there, he is not a legitimate president. And that's something held by, almost half the country. That's very damaging.
Yeah, and Republicans worry that Democratic leaders are going to say from now on they're mail-in ballots, and then Republicans will never have high-ranking positions. And all these Democrats are moving down south to these southern states and turning them purple.
It's obvious. Going away.
For over a year, Senator Johnson and I investigated the Biden's financial family dealings. For over a year, the liberal media and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle falsely said that we were peddling Russian disinformation. They ginned up any story they could to do and falsely portray our investigation in an effort to delegitimize the report's findings. Even my colleague, Senator Wyden, whom I've worked with on many bipartisan investigations, said the following, quote, "This disinformation also became the basis of the Johnson-Grassley investigation. The political nature of this investigation has been clear all along. Bottom line, the Johnson-Grassley investigation is baseless. It is laundering Russian propaganda for circulation in the United States," end quote. It seems the liberal media and Democrats have a very nervous tick. Anytime a Republican gets close to the truth and is about to serve justice, the other side yells, "Russian disinformation." And of course, as we see now, that's a load of garbage. As I've said on this floor several times before, our report was rooted in information from U.S. government agencies and a left-aligned U.S. lobby shop that represented a corrupt Ukrainian gas company. And by now, the American people know that it's really the Democrats and liberal media that are connected to Russian disinformation. Just think of the Steele dossier. It was infected with Russian disinformation and paid for by the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign. The liberal media and those on the other side of the aisle were scared of the facts. They were scared that the American people would see the Biden family's deep and extensive link to foreign governments, including the Communist Chinese government. And once Senator Johnson and I released publicly our findings, those same liberal outlets said the report repackaged old material and that there wasn't really anything new to it. They went into full Joe Biden protection mode, and they didn't even try to hide it. One Washington Post columnist said, quote, "Even after accepting disinformation from Russian agents, Johnson and Grassley couldn't come up with anything new or interesting on Hunter Biden." Well, we know today the Post should be ashamed that they said that. Politico ran a story with this headline, quote, "GOP's senators anti-Biden report repackages old claims." And National Public Radio said about the New York Post Hunter Biden story, quote, "We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories, and we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' times on stories that are just pure distractions," end of NPR quote. Now look at what Twitter and Facebook did to Hunter Biden news. Simply said, they interfered in the election and gave the Biden campaign a multi-million-dollar in-kind donation courtesy of their blatant and unforgivable censorship. So, my fellow Americans, let us never forget what Twitter and Facebook did during the 2020 elections. Now let's fast forward to this very day. Now it's confirmed that Hunter Biden is under criminal investigation, reportedly for his taxes and financial dealings. The very fact pattern that we described in the Johnson-Grassley report. It shouldn't take Hunter Biden to confirm that he's under criminal investigation before the mainstream press gets permission from who, I don't know, to report the news. It's a complete outrage at the way the liberal media used its power to cover up facts relating to Hunter Biden and the Biden family, and yet ran stories after stories with false information about the Russian investigation into Trump and the credibility of the Steele dossier. The recent news also shows that a report was not baseless. That's a word that shows up all the time. And it didn't repackage old claims. That's another set of words that shows up quite regularly as people were trying to distract the Johnson and Grassley report. So quite the opposite. Our report was well-founded, ahead of the curve, and right on the money in more ways than one. Our report teed up the facts, but the mainstream press never stepped up to the plate. Some of the nation's supposedly leading press outlets, with teams of investigative reporters, were scooped by the Congress, the Johnson-Grassley report. Now, of course, they're scrambling to chase the story that they for so long ignored. Now, it didn't have to be this way. We already did much of the hefty lifting before issuing our report. The report made public information that hadn't ever been known before. For example, it showed the following: Hunter Biden and his associates and family members were connected to Chinese nationals and Chinese companies linked with the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. This includes the CEFC China Energy Company Limited and also that company's subsidiaries. Records show that a company linked to the communist regime sent Hunter Biden law firm millions of dollars. Other records show that Hunter Biden opened a line of credit with a Chinese national linked to the communist regime and funded it with approximately $100,000. And then he, James Biden, and Sarah Biden went on an extravagant global spending spree. Still, other records show that Hunter Biden, via his law firm, also sent $1 million to James Biden's consulting firm, the Lion Hall Group. These transfers began less than 1 week after CEFC sent $5 million to a company called Hudson West III, a company linked to CEFC and Chinese nationalists associated with the communist regime, which then sent money to Hunter Biden's law firm. When the bank contacted Sarah Biden, who was associated with the firm's bank account, she refused to answer their questions and provide any additional documentation. According to the records that we have on file, the bank submitted the account for closure. Senator Johnson and I recently issued a supplemental to our report that showed Hunter Biden's close business associate, Rob Walker, received $6 million from a Chinese company linked to the communist regime. Then there's yet another link in the chain from the Biden family and their associates to the Chinese government. The report also showed that State Department officials believed that Hunter Biden's Burisma board membership created a perception of a conflict of interest and, quote, was very awkward for U.S. officials pushing an anti-corruption agenda in Ukraine, end of quote from a State Department official. Secretary of State Kerry publicly denied knowing Hunter Biden's role on the Burisma board. We acquired evidence that shows that Kerry did, in fact, know about that role. On December 2015, instead of following U.S. objectives of confronting oligarchs, Vice President Biden's staff advised him to avoid commenting on Burisma's oligarch and instead say, quote, I'm not going to get into naming names or accusing individuals, end of quote. Joe Biden was running an anti-corruption agenda in Ukraine, but he pulled his punches while his son was on the board of Burisma. Based on witness testimony, Burisma's owner allegedly paid a $7 million bribe to officials serving under Ukraine's prosecutor general to shut the case against him. When he allegedly paid that bribe, Hunter Biden was on the Burisma board. These examples are just a sampling from the report that Senator Johnson and I put out, and just the tip of an iceberg with respect to the Biden family's troubled ties to governments adverse to U.S. interest. These associations and the millions of dollars that pass between and among Hunter Biden, James Biden, and others create criminal, financial, and counterintelligence and extortion concerns. That's why I've written to the Justice Department about the risks that Hunter and James Biden essentially served as agents of the communist government for purposes of their registering under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. After Hunter Biden publicly confirmed he was under criminal investigation, liberal news outlets reported on concerns that his financial associations could create criminal, financial, and counterintelligence problems, something you heard from the Johnson-Grassley report several weeks ago. That's why we said in September 2020, and we were roundly criticized for it. And just over the weekend, a new email was made public that reportedly says that Joe Biden and his brother were, quote unquote, office mates with the very same Chinese nationals that we wrote about in our report. Those same individuals were the ones with links to the communist regime and that regime's military. Based on all the facts known to date, Joe Biden has a lot of explaining to do. I've run many oversight operations and investigations during the course of my career. I'm interested in the facts, in evidence, and in the truth. I learned a lesson a long time ago when I first started my oversight focus. That is, no matter how difficult the media or the other side of the aisle makes it to find the facts, never give up, keep working hard. The American taxpayers deserve nothing less. That's the attitude and approach that I've had my entire career. And it's what I will take with me as I continue to look into the Biden family matters and as I move to a leadership position on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I yield the floor.